I'm Patrick McNee. Leonardo da Vinci is perhaps the most enigmatic figure the world of art has ever produced. He created two of the most famous paintings in the world, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. Although few people know that his entire collection of paintings only numbers 15, including his two most famous, this makes absolute sense when one considers he was also a sculptor, architect, musician, engineer, and natural scientist. Given his varied interests, it's no wonder he found it impossible to devote his life to a single pursuit: painting. Leonardo was possibly the most curious man who ever lived. Everything he saw made him ask, how and why? He was also rather difficult to define. Leonardo used code and encryptions in many of his documents. He often wrote from right to left. And although his paintings were of a religious bent, Leonardo was by no means a devout Christian. In fact, some people believe that he inserted subversive messages or secret puzzles in his seemingly religious paintings. He may have hidden the answers to the mystery of these paintings in his strange writings. Let's journey into the mystifying world of Leonardo da Vinci and unravel the mysteries that surround this Renaissance genius. One only needs to look at Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man to glimpse his genius for drawing, symmetry, and guise. At first glance, it is a drawing of a man within a circle and a square. But Da Vinci, in fact, has solved a mathematical question that many have tried in vain to unravel. Vitruvian stated that the construction of a temple or building should be based on the proportions of man, since they were perfect. He says that the human body with arms and legs extended should fit into the perfect geometric forms, the circle and the square. An illustration of Vitruvian Man by Cesariano reeks of failure. Cesariano drew a perfect circle and square tangent to each other at the 4 points of the square. Then he forced a figure of a man into the design so that his hands and feet touched the points. The result was one of the most disproportionate figures of the Renaissance, with arms too long, legs too short, and hands and feet too big. A system of relationships alone did not make beauty happen. It took the genius of Leonardo da Vinci to solve the problem. Leonardo started by drawing a perfectly proportioned man and then found the circle and the square in the figure. The circle and square are only tangent at one place, the base. The thing that he added was beauty. Leonardo infused the drawing with a number of hidden equations. For instance, the length of a man's outspread arms is equal to his height. The width of the shoulders is 1/4 of a man. From the elbow to the tip of one's longest finger is 1/5 of a man. The distance from the elbow to the armpit will be 1/8 of the man. And the distance from the bottom of the chin to the nose and from the roots of the hair to the eyebrows is the same, and along with the ear creates 1/3 of the face. Leonardo writes his codes and observations in his cryptic script above and below the drawing. Leonardo's artwork goes beyond the obvious. The characters in his painting seem to have their own stories, separate from what's being portrayed. Just what is the Mona Lisa smiling about? And what's all the activity in the Last Supper? We are about to find out. The identity of the woman Da Vinci painted in the Mona Lisa has puzzled many through its long history. A very old method used for encoding intentional messages into artistic works is the Kabbalistic interpretation called gematria. This method assigns numbers to letters, so Mona Lisa would be represented by this equation. Another name for Mona Lisa is La Gioconda, which equals this equation. The measurement of the circumference of the painting equals 84. And if we add up the numbers to Leonardo's name, once again, the number 84. Could it be that the mysterious lady is none other than the master himself? Da Vinci's Last Supper is as famous and well known as the Mona Lisa. Did Leonardo leave hidden messages called Renaissance clues in his most religious artworks? Lynn Pickett, co-author of The Templar Revelation, takes us on a guided tour of this masterpiece.
Leonardo, while being very antagonistic towards the church and indeed towards mainstream Christianity, despite the so-called holy paintings he painted, his work does show marked Templarist symbolism. There were great Templar influences still around in Leonardo's day, possibly at a secret level. For one of the world's most famous and most familiar paintings, Leonardo's Last Supper contains an astonishing wealth of rather in-your-face esoteric symbolism, which is by no means mainstream Christian. For example, next to Jesus, there is a disciple doing that in a rather menacing way, if you look closely into Jesus' face. Jesus is quite oblivious to this, but it's that. We call this the John gesture because it's so obvious. And in the Last Supper, it's as if this disciple is saying to Jesus, "Remember John." Also in the Last Supper, Leonardo painted himself as one of the disciples towards the end of the table, turned away from Jesus. This was no accident. This wasn't just because to make a pretty composition. It was a gesture of extreme distaste for the Holy Family and for Jesus. Also in the Last Supper, sitting next to Jesus is this figure leaning like this away, which is known as the young St. John. But if you look very closely, you will notice that this St. John is in fact a woman. She has a little gold necklace, she has breasts, and the shape that she, together with Jesus, make in the composition is a giant spread-eagled M shape. And this M refers to Mary Magdalene. The Templars believed that Mary Magdalene was Jesus' lover, concubine, partner in sacred sex. This was Leonardo's way of expressing that belief. And so if you look at a painting that's supposed to be a great Christian painting of the Last Supper of Jesus, you are not going to sit there and say, but that looks like a woman, because it's supposed to be St. John, so you will see St. John. Equally, Leonardo has had fun with the people who were going to see the painting, because there is an anomalous hand with a dagger in it, pointing at one of the disciples' stomachs. And yet, in all our research into Leonardo, we've only ever come across a mention of this, and a very brief mention it was too, of this hand with a dagger. There is no great cup in the Last Supper in front of Jesus himself, as one would expect, and indeed in many other paintings of Last Supper there is the great cup, the chalice, what most people consider to be the Holy Grail. This is significantly missing from Leonardo's painting. Most people who think they know the painting have never seen it, because it's, it has nothing to do with their perception of the Last Supper, so they simply don't see it.
There is a secret society in France that claims Leonardo as one of its members, the Priory of Sion. The presence of this priory became known in 1975, when a startling discovery was made in a Parisian library. Once again, parchments were found. This time they were called les dossiers secrets. These documents were said to reveal some of the secret members to be Sir Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, and yes, Leonardo Da Vinci. But what is the Priory of Sion? According to these parchments, the objective of the organization was to restore the Moravian bloodline to the thrones of Europe. The priory believed that the Moravian kings were descendants of Jesus Christ, which would imply that Jesus didn't die on the cross, and did in fact marry and produce offspring, a belief that could potentially shatter the very foundation of Christianity. The society's purpose was to guard the secret that Jesus didn't die for our sins and that his descendants walk among us. The Renaissance clues left by Leonardo are quite provocative. One can understand why he would choose such covert methods to reveal his secrets. At the time, the church was a very powerful force, and a person could find himself in a great deal of trouble for challenging their accepted view. The next logical question that one is compelled to ask is, from where did Leonardo da Vinci receive this secret information? For that answer, we must start 400 years before Da Vinci's time with a group of 9 men who may just have been the source of the secret and powerful information that Leonardo possessed.
Everything about the Knights Templar has at least an element of mystery about it. Right from its beginnings, it was founded just after the First Crusade, which had reopened the way between Europe and the Holy Land. And in about 1118, 9 French knights, all of whom were connected with the court of the Count of Champagne, went over to the Holy Land with this mission, they said, to protect the roads and the pilgrimage routes, to make them safe for pilgrims who would now be able to visit the holy places.
Originally calling themselves the Poor Fellow Knights of Jesus Christ, these 9 men quartered themselves in the Temple Mount and began their mission. But just what was this mission? How were 9 men, even trained knights, supposed to guard the roads from Europe to Jerusalem?
Now, once they arrived in the Holy Land, there's actually no evidence that actually did anything for 9 years or so. And right from the beginning, there's something that doesn't quite connect. And there's other evidence that this mission of protecting the pilgrimage routes was actually just a cover story. They actually went there for another reason. For some reason, these 9 knights thought that there was something to be found there. There's certainly evidence that they excavated beneath the Temple Mount. Archaeologists have actually found Templar artifacts from those excavations.
As it turns out, the Templars spent very little time on the roads at all. Most of their 9-year stay was spent digging out old tunnels under the Temple Mount, the original site of the biblical Temple of Solomon. What were they looking for? The Temple of Solomon had long since been destroyed. Yet in times of trouble, the priests were known to have hidden religious treasures in secret underground vaults until it was safe to remove them. The Bible tells us that the Ark of the Covenant and other treasures of the temple survived several foreign invasions in this way. Perhaps the Holy Grail had survived in the labyrinth under the temple as well, waiting for man to rediscover its power. Certainly, it was no accident that the knights stationed themselves in a mosque that rested on the ancient site. In fact, it was after their stay that they changed their name to the Knights of the Temple, or the Knights Templar. A monk by the name of Bernard, who later became Saint Bernard, was involved in the formation of the Templars. St. Bernard was involved in deciphering ancient Hebrew text.
Bernard, although in many ways a very worldly person, was also very spiritual. In ways that are quite odd for his time, he was very much into the feminine side of religion, very much into the Black Madonna cults of, particularly of the south of France, which are very kind of mysterious, almost pagan. He had a great veneration for the feminine, embodied in lots of ways in the Virgin Mary, which was actually quite unusual for his time, and that appears to be the thing that drove him more than anything else. St Bernard was a very learned man, again for his time. Yes, he studied Hebrew texts, studied other texts as well. It could well be something that he found in there that gave these people the idea that there's something worth having in Jerusalem. It's speculative, but it's a good speculation. It seems a very logical thing. You have people studying these old documents who suddenly want to get their people to some of these old places mentioned in these documents. They're looking for something. Personally, I honestly don't know what it was they found, except that people considered it important. Nobody knows for sure. Whatever it was, nobody knows where it went. And it's a real mystery, but there's no shortage of theories, any of which could be correct. Documents, Ark of the Covenant, Holy Grail, whatever that is, but they certainly had their secret.
A very old text records the find. We repaired to the secret vault and let down one of the companions as before. The sun at this time was at its meridian height, the rays of which enabled him to discover a small box or chest standing on a pedestal curiously wrought and overlaid with gold. He gave the signal of ascending, and it was immediately drawn out. We have brought it up for the examination of the Grand Council. Just what was in this small box that got the Templars so excited? Clearly a group of Christian knights bound by the vow of poverty were not interested in anything of material value. More likely, it was an object of great religious significance. What we do know is that news of the find brought Count Hughes of Champagne, the man who bankrolled the expedition back to Jerusalem to join his former vassals. Once there, he immediately gave up all his worldly possessions to serve under them as one of the Knights Templar. It was after this discovery that the Grand Master of the Templars visited the Pope, and with St. Bernard's blessing, the Order of the Knights Templar was officially recognized by the Church. All over Christendom, men rushed to join the Knights, leaving behind their families, giving over all of their worldly possessions, and taking on the difficult vows of poverty and chastity.
The vow of poverty actually is why they became wealthy, because anybody that joined the order, anyone that became a Templar Knight, had to give all their possessions to the order. And it became quite a prestigious thing for noble families to have some of their sons go into the Templar order. And of course, any money and property they had would go into the coffers. Also, when the Pope endorsed the order, gave it his blessing and said, this is a good thing, anyone that wanted to impress the Pope donated land and money to this new order, and actually on a colossal scale. None of the individual knights were allowed to own anything, so that all this material that, land, castles, livestock, and just pure money that was just given to them as a gift, went towards the order. Their reputation was as the most feared, efficient fighting force on the Christian side. They were kind of the special forces of their time. Also because they were this mixture of monk and a soldier. They're almost like the Eastern martial arts that we think of today, where you actually learn it within a temple and there's a spiritual dimension to what you're doing. So that's it. But they were very feared fighters. They were the best we had.
There are legends that tell of the Templars finding the Holy Grail and carefully guarding its power through the ages.
The rank and file, the ordinary Templars, were no more than, and no less than they appeared to be, warrior monks who were mainstream Christians. But the inner circle had a secret, and they maintained this secret. And that secret appears to be, it was very carefully and very cleverly hidden in plain sight in many respects. The Templars were the driving force behind many of the great Gothic cathedrals in Europe, especially in France. And they all have the rose window, and that was a code also for sacred sexuality, because the rose representing the feminine, but also it was a pun, rose being an anagram of eros, the driving force of sexuality. The renowned author Hugh Schonfield has shown that the word Baphomet is actually a code. It means Sophia, which means in turn feminine wisdom, which is very interesting because everybody always thinks of the Templars as being macho, butch, completely male warrior monks, sort of swashbuckling characters. And what on earth would they have to do with the feminine? But curiously, they do seem to have had great reverence for goddesses, for the feminine side. The Templars had become, in a couple of short centuries really, extremely powerful. They were far too big for their boots in many respects, certainly as far as the Pope and many kings were concerned. They were unbelievably rich. It seemed there was no stopping them, basically. Most historians believe that they got their comeuppance because of their wealth. Essentially, the French king who started the suppression of the Templars, Philip the Fair, essentially that he was jealous of their great wealth. And it is generally thought that he used accusations of blasphemy and sacrilege against them, but really he wanted their money. The charges against the Templars were blasphemy and sacrilege, and that they failed to observe the usual reverence for the church, but that was well known. There were sexual elements in the charges, but then there always are, when you think about it, in charges against heretical groups. They were accused of sodomy, of homosexual acts. They were accused of spitting and trampling upon the cross, of worshipping not just a bearded severed head, but in some extraordinary cases they were accused of worshipping the severed head of a cat.
The Catholic Church got the confessions that it needed to suppress the Templars and confiscate their treasury. But did they seize the Templars' most prized possession? After the Templars were suppressed, a new religious group came to prominence in southern France near Carcassonne, the Cathars.
The Cathars were an extraordinary group of people, especially for their own day, because they challenged the Church of Rome on many points. They were a kind of purified and basic Christian religion. They were vegetarians, which was very strange in those days. They believed in reincarnation. They had both male and female preachers. They travelled and stopped wherever they were welcome, pretty much as one might imagine Jesus and John the Baptist would have done. They were known by the local people as the good people, which rather says it all, I think. But of course, the fact that they did not acknowledge the church's authority in any way, that they didn't have churches, they didn't give any money to any organisation that the Church of Rome could organise and take from. The Cathars may well have had secrets that threatened to undermine the authority of the Church, secrets about Christianity. And it does seem that they had some knowledge, certainly a very strong belief indeed, because they actually went to the torture and to a very, very painful death believing this, without recanting it, that Mary Magdalene was actually Jesus' lover. This, of course, still is counter to mainstream Christian belief. They appear to have had a Gnostic gospel, which we no longer know about. And this may have been their own version, if you like, of the Holy Grail, their great treasure. When they were finally exterminated, their extermination was long and drawn out and extremely painful, but it culminated on March the 14th, 1244, at the extraordinary citadel of Montségur in the foothills of the Pyrenees, on the border between France and Spain. The Crusaders camped in the valley, and above them, this sheer rock, it is quite the most astonishing thing, goes straight up into the sky, and on the top of that is the citadel, the Cathar citadel of Montségur. And they'd been besieged for a long time, and they knew this was the last. They were willing, the Cathars were willing to come out and be murdered, basically. They were quite, curiously enough, quite happy about it, because they believed in reincarnation, so they would have another life and meet each other again. But they said to the soldiers, give us just one last night, we need to do something special. And the general idea is they had some kind of ritual that they all did together before giving themselves up. But also during that last night, it is known that 4 Cathars got away. They climbed, most astonishing journey in itself, I mean, what a feat. They climbed over the citadel and down this sheer rock face and off somewhere. Now, it is said that they had the Cathar treasure with them. Now, it couldn't have been gold or money in some way, because it's known where that had gone. It had already gone to a certain place. And it had to be something portable, because, you know, they were carrying it. And it has been suggested that they had the Holy Grail with them, whatever that is. But perhaps they had this Gnostic gospel with them, whatever that was. It is rumoured it was the Gnostic gospel of John, which is not the same, was not the same as the Gospel of John in the New Testament. Or it could have been that the 4 Cathars themselves were somehow important. But no one perhaps will ever know.
Did the Catholic Church suppress the Templars and the Cathars because of their religious beliefs? Or were they tortured and finally eradicated because they possessed the Holy Grail? What could be so threatening to the Church that they would eliminate any vestige of these religious orders? Could it be that the Catholic Church was looking for the Holy Grail? But what is the Holy Grail? There are many theories.
The earliest description of the Holy Grail is as a platter with miraculous properties, that it can, you know, produces huge amounts of food. It's a platter that's never emptied. You know, there'll always be food in it.
Despite the fact that these days most people think of the Grail as a cup, the cup that was used at the Last Supper by Jesus and was perhaps used to gather his blood at the crucifixion. It probably, if it ever existed as an object, was never a cup.
People have puzzled over the term Holy Grail. I mean, the original version is San Grail, which is taken as Holy Grail. So whatever this Grail is, it's a holy one of it. People have puzzled over the term for, you know, decades, and no one's really explained what it actually means. But it's true that the word Grail, it's a term nobody quite understands, and you think, well, if people were writing this story, why didn't they just say what it is instead of using this term? And so it's either meant to be that it's something totally elusive. In fact, probably, you know, the object in a sense doesn't matter. It's the search for that object, what the object means, that's important. Or that they were trying to hide what the Grail was.
There were some Grail stories talked of the Grail being a stone. This is quite interesting in itself, because in recent years there has been quite a lot of research into the search for the Ark of the Covenant and for the tablets that were supposed to be, that God wrote the Ten Commandments on and put in the Ark of the Covenant. It may be that the Grail stories, in which the Grail, the secret object, was something like a lance, is connected, perhaps somewhat cynically, with the relic trade, which was just picking up business at the time of the most popularity of the Grail stories. Relics were huge business in medieval Europe. The lance that was supposed to pierce the side of Jesus when he hung on the cross would obviously pull in a lot of curious pilgrims who would, swell the coffers of the people who had it. Maybe that's an over-cynical view. Certainly, our research into the relic trade has shown that the Templars themselves were not averse to using objects to swell their already quite overflowing coffers. A lot of people think, probably rightly, that the Grail was some kind of information, maybe a great secret of some description. And therefore it's quite likely that over the centuries various groups of people might have thought they found it, or thought they're about to find it. And it's possible that if it were a secret, that the Templars, who were quite a secretive bunch themselves for very good reasons, had found it. But in the end, the Grail doesn't appear really to be important as an object, and I think that's where an awful lot of people go wrong, because it's the Grail quest that is the most sublime thing that a man or a woman can do. It evokes the ultimate mystical experience.
There is a great deal of interest in the Grail legend, no matter what it is. Some people have set off on a personal quest simply to discover hidden places in Europe where unexplained incidences have occurred. These may point to the mysteries that accompany the Grail. One such place is in the south of France. One must make a trip to a very small village in the Languedoc region of France called Rennes-le-Château. It is here the story of Berenger Saunière begins.
The mystery is that the priest in Rennes-le-Château, whose name was Saunière, suddenly became immensely wealthy and spent vast amounts of money on what appeared to be very eccentric building works in this village. His church, which was dedicated to Mary Magdalene, very, very old church, he filled it with very, very strange carvings and decorations.
In fact, in 1885, Berenger Saunière was sent to renovate the church of St. Mary Magdalene. At that time, Rennes-le-Château was a poor, small village of perhaps 300 residents. The renovation of the church was not a priority for the townspeople, making money scarce for the project. Luckily, Saunière found a patron for his remodeling in the Countess of Chambord, who provided ample funds for the work. During the reconstruction, while dismantling an altar pillar, the workers found buried within the pillar 3 wooden tubes sealed with wax. Within the tubes were a number of parchments. Saunière, an educated man, tried to decipher the text of these parchments with very little success. He then took the parchments to Paris, where he called on a fellow priest, Abbé Biel. Biel had more success decoding the parchments. The nature of the inscriptions were never revealed. Yet, as more parchments were deciphered, Saunière's social stature in Paris society began to elevate. It was on his return from Paris that the priest's fortune began to change. Seemingly out of nowhere, money became available to Saunière.
He built a villa for himself. He built a tower overlooking the hill. He built some landscape gardens. But everything's kind of like weird and symbolic. And so he spent an absolute fortune, spent a fortune on food and drink and entertaining people that would come down from Paris. And the mystery has always been, where did he get the money from?
Saunière continued his renovation of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene. he added many strange and symbolic elements. The Latin greeting over the door, Terribilis iste locus este, translates to, "This place is terrible." The baptismal font is supported by the devil. And perhaps strangest of all is the exalted position of Mary Magdalene, not the most revered biblical image. His church was named for her. He erected a tower called La Tour de Magdala, the most outstanding feature of the small town. Could that be the connection between Saunier and his reverence for Mary Magdalene?
What Saunier found, there have been lots of theories about what he might have found, and the usual suspects really. There's some people think he might have found where the Ark of the Covenant had been hidden by the Templars, people that think he might have found the Holy Grail, people that might think he might have found some great secret connected with alchemy that made him be able to produce lots of gold. They are all theories. No one's actually come up with anything solid.
If Saunier's life was filled with mystery, his death was as well. Upon his deathbed, Saunier summoned his good friend Abbé Rivière to administer last rites. Rivière left the dying man's room with a look of shock and fear, as if he had seen the devil himself. It was said that Rivière spent the rest of his years as a recluse, speaking to no one. What was Saunier's shocking deathbed confessional? Did he possess the secret bloodline of Jesus? Did his fortune come from blackmailing the Vatican?
Rennes-le-Château is in an area of France that really was the Templar heartland. Although the Templars owned so much property everywhere in Europe, a third of everything they owned was in the Languedoc, this area of south of France, where Rennes-le-Château is. So that was the big area for them. It could very well be where their treasure was taken from Paris. So some people have said the thing that Saunier found was the Templar treasure.
The mystery of Rennes-le-Château and Bérengère Saunier remains to this day. Rennes-le-Château was not the only resting place for the Holy Grail. Scotland is another country with strong ties to the Templars, and in Rosslyn Chapel, a mystery of the Holy Grail is inscribed throughout the structure of the church.
Rosslyn Chapel has been described as the most superbly carved reliquary of the Holy Grail. It records every known spiritual pathway at the time it was built, in the mid-15th century. And it was built as a memorial to the beliefs of the Knights Templar. But the masterstroke in bringing the Knights Templar teachings to the wider world was the creation of the legends of the Holy Grail. It supposedly tells the story of a search for a holy relic associated with Jesus, the cup used at the Last Supper, or according to another version, the cup that was used to catch Jesus' blood after the crucifixion. But, and I intend to believe this, that masterly American, wonderful man, Professor Joseph Campbell, says that it was nothing more nor less than a coded pathway of initiation, a spiritual pathway that told a very different truth to that told by Holy Mother, the Church, that in fact encompassed the true teachings of Jesus. Teachings that teach us to live according to we thinking rather than me thinking, and to give the fruits of the sacred knowledge that is granted at initiation, not for personal salvation or any personal motive of gain, but to benefit the entire community within which you move. The Knights Templar transformed the face of Europe, and with their banking system they invented the note of hand, the checkbook, and the credit card, which may come as something of a surprise to Barclaycard, Visa, and American Express. But the credit card was invented back in the 12th century by the Knights of the Holy Grail. But more importantly, through their teachings, through the Grail legends, and through the use of the tarot cards, they passed the message that direct access to God was possible by ordinary people without the intervention of the church. And like all who preached heretical messages, they came to a violent and a sticky end. We owe a great debt to the Knights of the Holy Grail. But we are missing the point entirely if we think their true effects were simply political or military. Brave and all as they were, stupendous as the transformation was in Europe as a result of their actions, the real heart of their message is one that is a vibrant one and one of great importance to more and more people at this particular time. The search for spiritual enlightenment, the true search for the Holy Grail. And to our right, on this grassy bank, underneath there, was the famous library of the Sinclairs, which held a priceless collection of manuscripts. And it was during the construction of the chapel, when this castle took fire, that Earl William was more concerned with the safety of his writs and charters, his priceless manuscripts, than he was for the ladies of the house, which was rather an odd situation for a very chivalrous man. Those writs and charters included some of the documentation which had been excavated from under the Temple Mount in Jerusalem by the Knights Templar, and which Knight and Lomas now claim, and I tend to agree with them, lie buried in the vaults beneath Rosslyn Chapel. This is a beautiful example of the Green Man. It's a type of iconography that was very popular with the medieval Masons, so much so that it almost became their mascot. There are 86 of them in Chartres Cathedral, and in this tiny place there are well over 120, and we're still counting. It was of some significance to the Knights Templar, because it, to them, represented the resurrecting god Tammuz, the consort of Ishtar. Another sign of Templar involvement is the symbolism known as the Templar seal, and we see it up here at the top of this pillar. Two hands pulling aside curtains, revealing a paschal lamb with a flag above it. The retro choir is separated from the main body of the chapel by three very important pillars. The symbolism behind these pillars was of great importance to the Knights Templar and to their later heirs, the Freemasons. The first pillar, to my right, is the Mason's pillar, intricately carved, and it represents wisdom. The central pillar, or journeyman's pillar, which is capped by this beautiful basket work, represents strength. But the third pillar, not surprisingly, is held to represent beauty. It's a representation of the tree of life with the dragons of Niflheim gnawing at its roots. The three pillars, wisdom, strength, and beauty, should stand on the sure foundation of truth and justice, which are the true foundation of any lodge of fraternal Freemasons, and which, of course, were the founding principles on which the Knights Templar were built. Another sign of Templar symbolism is the Mandelion, a cloth imprinted with the face of Jesus, such as the Shroud of Turin, or in this case, the Veil of Veronica, where the legend says that Veronica wiped the face of Jesus en route to Calvary, and his face was, as if by magic, imprinted on the cloth. And you can see in the carving the face gleaming from the cloth. This lintel has carved upon it a quotation from the book of Esdras. Wine is strong, A king is stronger, women are stronger still, but truth conquers all. The most obvious and the most famous Templar sign of them all is two brothers on one horse. I have that seal on my keyring. And that could not be openly displayed for fear of persecution on charges of heresy. So in this chapel with the Sinclair family history, they got round it rather neatly. This is held to symbolize the two brothers on one horse, but if you look at it, you will find that the rear figure, riding pillion, is female. It has long hair and the vestiges of a skirt. But the whole business of symbolism had to be hidden if you were showing signs of an alternative belief system. Because anybody who diverged from church thinking was invited to the next church barbecue, not as the main guest, but as the chief item on the menu. Remember what happened to Jacques de Molay, the Grand Master of the Templars. He was cooked slowly over a fire.
We have witnessed the power the Church has wielded throughout the ages. The suppression of the Templars and the Cathars pales in light of the destruction of the Spanish Inquisition. Was the Church always this powerful? How and when did it gain its strength? Once again, it's time to take a further look back in time to the period when Constantine was the Holy Roman Emperor and Christianity was struggling to find its voice. It may come as a surprise to many how the Church, as we know it today, came to be. It took over 300 years to take shape.
In the period we are talking about, the Roman state was largely tolerant of foreign religions. They adopted a policy that as long as the taxes were paid and as long as you did not engage in a rebellion against them, they would tolerate your religious practices as long as they were not contrary to good order and the common stability of the state and the people locally. At the time, we have many people who are still, we presume, subscribing to the local indigenous religions, fertility cults, ancient rituals, which would even perhaps antedate Judaism. Also, you have Judaism itself. Judaism generally made a single distinction between those who were Jews and those who were Gentiles or non-Jews. And so the distinction for them would have been us and then everyone else. It's often not realized that Alexander the Great, who is active about 300 before the Common Era, 300 years before Jesus is born, Alexander the Great plays a major role in the spread of Christianity. First of all, by conquering the virtually entire known world at that time, Alexander the Great spread Greek culture and most importantly the Greek language throughout all of these areas. And that is the language in which the Christian Gospels seem to have been originally written. In the beginning, Christianity was somewhat anarchic. That is, it did not have a rigid system of organization. The earliest Christians, immediately after the death of Jesus, viewed themselves as simply an extension of Judaism. In that sense, they had already differentiated themselves from the ancient cults associated with fertility, perhaps worship of astrological bodies such as the moon, the sun, the stars. The Judaic Christians were interested only in converting other Jews to Christianity. Shortly after the arrival of Christianity on the scene in Judaism, a person named Saul converts to Christianity and he becomes known as Paul, St. Paul. His vision of Christianity is somewhat different than that of James and the earliest Christians in Jerusalem. He receives the message, the understanding that all human beings, regardless of their racial or religious background, can become Christians. Paul preaching his version of the gospel and converting people to his brand of Gentile Christianity, to Greek Christianity, and this, of course, without the hindrances or the impediments of mandatory circumcision, kosher dietary regulations, and the other things that would have seemed strange to a pagan. Without those things, Gentile Christianity flourished and was successful and became the dominant form of Christianity that, of course, we know today. One of the great problems in early Christianity was to reconcile the varying theologies that had developed in these various camps of Christianity. This, of course, led to a relatively anarchic setup within Christianity. If the Holy Spirit is giving revelations to anybody and everybody, then it's very difficult to have a common belief and a common creed to which you are going to subscribe. But starting with the year 64 and the fire in Rome and Nero's persecution, you begin to have a series of actions taken against Christians, which are known as these persecutions in the early church.
Early persecutions in the 1st and 2nd century were very local. There were outbreaks of violence or resentment against Christians. Sometimes they were accused by their slaves. What's so intriguing is that when persecutions broke out against the Christians, what they were accused of was cannibalism, incest, and atheism. Cannibalism because of the language that was used for their ritual of the Lord's Supper. Incest for their styling of their community as familial relations and their emphasis on love. And atheism because they refused to honor the civic deities.
Another aspect of the persecutions is that, of course, the Christians, a relatively new religious group, even though they are coming out of Judaism, they, of course, are claiming that they have the one true religion, the one true way of understanding the world, the universe, and what's going to happen to everyone. This, of course, doesn't necessarily go down with people who have been members of other religions for a very long time and who are members of ancient religious cults elsewhere in the empire. There was a certain amount of tension between the Christians and the other religious groups. We have the persecutions. The Emperor Constantine, wanting peace within his empire and wanting these Christian groups to quit squabbling over theology, convenes the Council of Nicaea in 325. And Constantine himself appears to have chaired the council and entered into the debates. In some ways, the Council of Nicaea can be regarded as one of the key points in the founding of Christianity as it will continue through the centuries on into the Middle Ages and to the modern period.
So what evolved then as a resolution to that tension was the doctrine of the Trinity, in which the very nature of God is reconceptualized. Not any longer as the one God, but reconceptualized as the three in one. And it was during this process that the divinity of the Holy Spirit was also articulated and argued for and became a point of contention and eventually became a central point of Christian doctrine. And it's that process that then transforms, in a sense, the Christian doctrine of God as it was, say, in the 1st century to a fully developed Trinitarian idea of God.
In some ways, the Council of Nicaea can be regarded as one of the key points in the founding of Christianity as it will continue through the centuries on into the Middle Ages and to the modern period. Although the creed that is now known as the Nicene Creed was revised later, at least according to tradition, it goes back to the decisions made at the Council of Nicaea. One of the problems that Christianity faced at this period was not just the division between the Arians and the anti-Arians, that is, between the same substance and the similar substance parties, but there were also other groups around. Among them were the Gnostics, the people who believed that knowledge was very important and that secret instruction was very important, and that by studying, by learning, you rose through a layer of hierarchies and eventually could experience God in a divine revelation, personally, just yourself.
If the structure of the church involved so much debate, what about the book on which it is founded, the New Testament? Were the 27 Gospels that comprise the New Testament written and compiled during Jesus' lifetime? Or did the creation of that book mirror the formation of the church?
Many people don't realize that the creation of the New Testament was a very long and painful process. The New Testament, the 27 books that Christians now consider to be authoritative, did not simply fall out of the heavens at some early point in Christianity.
Of course, the process of how the New Testament came to be the way we have it today is a controversial and vexed issue. We believe now that there was already, within 20 or 30 years of the time of Jesus, a circulation of some of the sayings of Jesus written down. I mean, as people realized, hey, wait a minute, we're not going to have these people around much longer. We're not going to be able to just sit down and say, now, Peter, what did Jesus say when you asked him? But as that generation begins to pass, the later followers begin to realize, hey, we've got to write some of this stuff down so that we can use it and teach from it and share with other believers. So that led to the initial writing of these documents.
It's always fascinating to look at how the New Testament is put together, because as the Gnostic Gospels and the Dead Sea Scrolls prove, there were many important ancient writings that never made it into the Bible at all.
What's fascinating is that there are sources on Jesus outside of the biblical documents. I think most people don't know that. The apocryphal Gospels were responses to the original four Gospels. They tried to fill in the gaps in the Gospel records, the childhood stories of Jesus that are not reported. We have other stories, the history of Joseph the carpenter, which explains what they made in the carpenter shop. We have the Arabic Gospel of the Infancy, which talks about these wonderful stories about the palm tree on the way to Egypt. We have a lot of these accounts that retell the biblical episodes, but add all kinds of detail.
Well, some of them, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, was probably formulated in Gnostic circumstances, because there are tendencies in the way the story is told to stress Jesus's wisdom. The same thing is true of most of those infancy and extraneous Gospels, we can call them that, or apocryphal Gospels, that aren't in the mainstream, that weren't accepted as biblical. The history of the Gnostics is very interesting. Even as early as the 2nd century, they were that movement was a very strong movement. The Gnostic type of Christianity was the dominant type of Christianity.
Gnosticism comes from the term gnosis, to know, that is knowledge. And it was a sect, it was a philosophy that believed that there was a kind of secret knowledge that people should learn in order to fully understand what life was about, in order to understand what God was like.
They produced literature. There's a large amount of literature. In fact, the Gospels and the other Gnostic writings that recently were found are included in a book which is even longer than the New Testament itself. But then the official church eventually saw this as kind of an eccentric form of religion, off the beam, and took measures to suppress it. What happened to these Gospels, and why were they eliminated? Well, at one point, actually, the bishops of Rome condemned them and said they weren't to be used anymore. Then the bishops of Rome, the popes, started to try to eliminate the use of these other materials, which were considered to be not just irrelevant, but also harmful and damaging. One of the people there saw that the writing was on the wall for this Gnostic literature and put it all together and hid it at the face of a cliff.
How the Gnostic Gospels were brought back to life is as mysterious as the Gnostic sect itself.
The discovery of the Gnostic Gospels is an incredible story. It occurred in December of 1945 in Egypt along the Upper Nile River, about 300 miles to the south of Cairo. There was a group of camel drivers who were looking for fertilizer along the banks of the Nile. And one of the camel drivers happened upon an earthenware jar.
Ali! Ali, come quickly! What's going on?
His brother, who was the leader of the group, whose name happened to be Muhammad Ali, took the jar and thought at first that it might contain a genie, an evil spirit that would haunt him if he opened it. Then he thought that it might also contain gold. And finally, his greed overcame his fear.
Give me a shovel!
And for a few moments, he thought that he had discovered gold because the air was filled with tiny pieces of this yellow substance. And he very quickly realized that rather than gold, they were tiny pieces of papyrus.
When Ali unraveled the leather pouches, they contained old papyrus texts. The men left discouraged after seeing what they thought were worthless pieces of paper. Ali did take the contents of the earthen jar back with him, hoping to sell the leather for some money. He didn't realize that the papyrus papers he had found were Gnostic writing, long thought lost. The texts went through the hands of the Egyptian black market until American historian James Robinson took possession and began to translate them.
They were, in fact, priceless manuscripts, and that would constitute one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century.
We appear to have traveled a great distance from Leonardo da Vinci to the New Testament and then to Egypt and the discovery of ancient texts. Yet their path illuminates the fact that da Vinci may have known about the secrets that the Church tried to suppress for most of its history. Was Leonardo da Vinci a member of the Priory of Sion? Did he paint the figure of Mary Magdalene into the Last Supper? Did she produce heirs to his bloodline? We may never know for sure. It's interesting to note that the only post-ascension references to Mary Magdalene occur in the Gnostic Gospels, Gospels suppressed by the Church. The Gnostic Gospel of Philip says, there were three who walked with the Lord at all times, Mary his mother, her sister, and Magdalene, the one who is called his companion. Another Gnostic Gospel describes how Mary Magdalene aroused the jealousy of the apostles because she was the close consort of the Lord, who often kissed her on the mouth. One thing is for certain, the mystery of Leonardo's codes and who Mary Magdalene really was will forever spark people's imaginations. I'm Patrick McNee. Thank you for joining me on this fascinating journey.